Welcome, everybody. It is Business Monday, the 4 o'clock hour. It is smoking hot in downtown Providence, but we have the money man who keeps cold, cool cash on hand to keep everyone satisfied. Money man, how was your weekend?
Weekend was good.
Excellent.
Was good.
You were up in nice, cool Maine?
I always stay cool all the time.
Excellent. Let's talk about the 800, I think that's probably an understatement, it would be the 647 million pound elephant in the corner, UHIP. How in God's name could we have cost overruns really of $400 to $500 million?
You know, we were talking when Governor Chafee originally put this program in place, and we should talk about what UHIP is. It was supposed to be a computerized system to improve the efficiency and reduce the cost of providing social services to needy people, verify eligibility quicker, make sure the right people are on the roll and the wrong people were off the roll. So it had a worthwhile purpose. First screw up.
Well, first price was $119.
$119, but the first screw up was increasing it to $246 because the governor and some of her liberal henchmen were sold the idea that it just didn't need to apply to things that we were actually administering, like food stamps and Medicaid, but we could use it to coordinate our entire social service delivery system. That is a complex undertaking. That's a difficult technical problem to solve, and it shouldn't have been done so cavalier. So the first mistake was expanding, doubling, the program. And so the governor adjusted the price to $246. It hasn't worked since then. It was poorly thought out, it was poorly designed, it was poorly staffed. If you were writing a case study on how not to innovate and put in place a new technology, this would be the case study to do it. It gives me a thought. I think at Bryant we'll use that as a case study in some of our leadership programs. And so that was the first step.
So let me ask you a couple questions. Chafee's at 119. She takes it to 246, expands the model.
She changed the scope.
She changed the scope of the project. Since then, it has functionally just been downhill. Now, Saul Kaplan, who comes on right after you on Mondays, who worked at Anderson Consulting and built these types of technologies 20 years ago, says the entire technology infrastructure, and Saul's not one to criticize much, but says it was flawed. It should have been a cloud-based structure, should have been much more modular rather than one integrated, massive, complex system. When you have one of these things just going off the rail, what's the response of leadership?
Well, the response of leadership is to get the right people in that are capable of managing this process. And that involves working with more than one consultant. I would defer to Saul's judgment on that. He knows much more about the technology than I do. But if I was putting somebody in charge of the Office of Health and Human Services, I'd want a third consultant to tell me about what technology options I had. I wouldn't want to get so much in bed with one consultant. And it's interesting, that consultant was very well plugged in politically. Keep in mind that the work that was done at the Rhode Island Foundation with Brookings was in part funded by Deloitte. They were close to this administration. The other thing that I think would have been worth looking at when you use a consultant, this wasn't Deloitte's first rodeo.
No, it was not.
They had problems in a couple of other states implementing these types of programs which were less complex. So we put all our eggs in the basket of one consultant. We had a staff of people who may have been very good at social service programs, may have run social service programs. They understood nothing about implementing this technology, and so the state became a captive to the consultant. First rule of not the way to manage a project. There was no, they may identify somebody, but there was no ostensible clerk of the works, an equal person representing me as a taxpayer, representing the administration to deal with the consultant. So that was a mistake in just the organizational infrastructure. I can't think of one person who was an appointee of the governor as a director, department director, or a director of a secretariat that had 15 minutes experience with this type of technology. Well, that's a recipe for failure and to the best of intentions. The other issue and I may be a jury of one in this opinion. I think this administration overly politicized the issue. And the reason I say I think they over-politicized the issue, they were so concerned about getting it up and running before it was ready that it had to have been, it just had to have been a political decision. It could not have been a decision by the technical people. Certainly the federal government raised their eyebrows. They had a lot of questions about...
Warned them not to. Right. I mean, in fact, warned them not to.
And so the primary payer of the system, because keep in mind, we should put this in context kind of as an aside, of the $650 million project, Rhode Island taxpayers through Rhode Island taxes will pay $140 million, and the rest comes from feds unless the feds sue us to get some of this wasted money back. But so they ignored the advice of the primary funder of the project. Now, I work on programs which are endowed, and if the funder picks up the phone and says, Gary, I think you better look at that twice before you do something, I respect that. I look at it, I may still do it, but I look at it twice and 3 and 4 times. Here is a case where flat-out political judgment made was it'll look good if we can get this implemented with a technology state, rah-rah, and let's do it regardless of what the payer is saying, and whether it's ready, whether it just passes an acid test. Just spit on your finger, put it in the wind, and see which way the wind is blowing. And that was a political judgment. So we changed the scope without really understanding the technical complexities of what that meant. Not that it was a bad idea. Certainly the idea of an integrated system is a good idea. We then go ahead and snap the switch to keep it running. And I'm repeating myself, which seems to me more of a political than a management or technical judgment. We don't have people representing our interests, and so we become captive to this consultant who doesn't have the greatest track record on these kinds of projects in other states, and so there are problems. The fourth issue is there's always going to be snafus and problems when you do a project this big. One of the things that you're required to do is to have fallback systems. So we implement this project without a fallback system. If this thing was the most pristine implementation, if everything worked like it was supposed to have worked, there still would have been problems because of the complexities of what's involved. And we didn't have, I don't think anybody thought about 15 seconds about what a contingency plan should be. So what happens? And this is, and it's almost funny, but it's not funny because the people adversely impacted by this were our most needy people. And I will bet you $1 to a pickle that if Commerce RI, who's giving out all this corporate welfare to rich folks, went to a new technology conversion and it got down to this point, it would have been corrected. But we're dealing with needy folks that in some cases have good representation, in some cases don't. And so we end up with duplicate payments. We end up with dead people on the Medicaid eligibility rolls. Sounds like voting in Chicago.
Right.
We failed to calculate cost sharing, particularly for kids in families who were in subsidized child care services. We have backlogs. People can't get to their food stamps on time. Nursing homes are not paid on time. They have to guess what to give nursing homes so Medicaid eligible people can continue to get health services. More than 16,000 people who are not part of Medicaid were put on the Medicaid rolls. We failed to effectively update income eligibility. That sounds like an exaggeration. That's what happened.
Is this the biggest? You try and keep it in some level of context and not get caught up completely in the moment, but look at it within some historical judgment. Certainly, federal courts intervened in the 80s relative to the condition of the prison system in Rhode Island. Judge Patine put a special master in, and that was a major national news and national embarrassment.
It happened in other states too.
Right,
prisons,
California, etc.
Alabama, sure.
Is this the biggest governmental faux pas in certainly modern Rhode Island history? I can't think of anything from a cost standpoint, a delivery standpoint, a length of time. Is there anything else like it?
Well, each faux pas is different, and you have to judge it. So I'll answer your question by giving you some examples.
Sure.
The credit union crisis.
Yeah.
That was big.
That was big.
And it took people couldn't get access to their money.
Yeah.
And it cost the
Failed regulatory structure in that
a
case.
failed regulatory structure, but it was the states. The state made policy decisions. The state made decisions on the credit union crisis of backing up their political buddies about the level of insurance and security for those investments, which poor people of Rhode Island didn't know about. So that was that certainly was but it was caused by politics.
Yeah.
It wasn't caused by management. It was just straight out politics. But that was a big one. Other big ones, were not quite as big. But let me talk about the registry, which is still a problem. And I was involved in this, and we made the same kinds of mistakes in hiring a consultant. Not had the faintest idea of what the consultant was going to do not upgrade, but to restore the vehicle and title and registration driver's license system, because the current system was about to collapse. And we spent much more money than we should have. I don't recall the numbers. We didn't have the right people inside state government to be our watchdogs on this. But the difference there, and it wouldn't have been as big as this one, but the difference there was nobody pulled the switch.
Yeah.
This is one place where I give this administration credit. They slowed down. They worked through the process. And so when the new system got implemented, it may not have been as perfect as people thought it would be, but it wasn't a fiasco. There's still long lines in the registry. It may not be realizing its potential.
You're talking about the registry now is a better system
but the point
than we've
was,
had before.
The point was it was smaller. It was in scale from UHAP, but it was the same kind of problem. Poorly designed RFP, not having the proper people inside government watching out for the state taxpayer and the agency. And moving ahead and being slave to different consultants. In this case, some of the consultants merged, someone out of business. It was different. But the judge, no one ever made, whether it was the Curiary administration, which I was involved with, or the Raimondo administration, made a political decision. Boy, we're not going to look good because this thing is 3 years behind schedule. So we're going to pull the plug and just blow everybody's driver's license and registration. They had the sense and the judgment to say, no, we can't do this because this is going to be a major screw-up. In the case of UHEP, same type of problem, small scale, but no one worried about the screw-up. And so that was the difference. So to answer your question, with the exception of the credit union, which was a different set of circumstances and different reasons, I can't think of a bigger administrative screw-up. And I think, and the other people that should get some notice in this too, is the legislature.
Yeah.
The legislature waited an enormously long period without exercising oversight. And when they began to exercise oversight, they held a lot of hearings. They were useful in getting some information out that otherwise might not have gotten out. But they did not subpoena people. They did not hold individuals accountable. It was, I would call, more like paper tooth oversight than vigorous, tiger bite your butt oversight.
So let's break down some of these issues. Some of the other catastrophic failures. Even in that year's dollars, can't think of anything that's in the range of $400 million of additional costs. Obviously, the credit union had cronyism and sort of political backdoor dealing.
And the costs, depending upon how you account for the selling of the assets, the costs were up there.
Yeah.
And there was an increase because there was, we worked on this.
Sales tax.
Yeah, well, see, when Dupree increased the sales tax from 6 to 7%, it had a sunset provision. It was for 1 year to get to a fiscal crisis. I remember working with the Southern administration saying, well, the way we could pay for it is just blank and not go back to where the sales tax should have been. Right. So there were all kinds of costs, and there were major costs. And that was a total bill on the state. There wasn't any federal participation. So when you talk about a $650 million bill, you're looking at about 80% of it is a federal cost. Just imagine, close your eyes for a second, and imagine that this was not a federal-state project, or it was a 50-50 federal-state project. Right. Instead of talking about $138 million, which, by the way, the state cost now is more than the total cost, federal and state, of the original project when Chafee was governor. But just imagine what the impacts would have been on the state's budget, on the state's...
Well, and the other issue on the $648 million cost is there are those who continue to report quietly that at the end of the day, the system still will not achieve what it is supposed to achieve and may have to be. And by the way, it's now a 5-year-old technology structure. You know, technology moves pretty quick. 5-year-old technology is old technology.
One of the most difficult management decisions that you have to make is if you make a decision and it's not working out, when do you cut your losses?
Absolutely.
And so, you know, we're clearly, you know, beyond the point. When it went from 246 to 320, we might have said that's the end of it, we're going to cut our losses, though it seemed high at the time. So we didn't cut our losses. And each month we look at it, and I give them this credit. I think the person that's an Office of Health and Human Service right now is paying much more attention to it. And there's been progress. The backlogs are down. The litany of things I spoke about a few minutes ago are, you know, not happening, you know, anymore. There's technical reasons why the system seems not to be, you know, working. You know, whether it's sustainable or not, you know, I don't know. But that decision, you know, needs to be made. The way the decision process is going forward raises to me a fundamental question of what is the proper legislative role. If the legislature is not going to exercise a role and cut the purse strings on the local, the federal, on the state participation, then there's nothing to stop an administration from doing their best, because the most difficult decision, as I said, is to know when to cut your losses, and we may be beyond that point. But the other bottom line too, which I think we have to recognize, you asked me how I know it's going to work. I can't give you the same kind of technical answer that Saul could, but I have, you know, a very simple way to think it's work. Are people getting their food stamps? Right. Are Medicaid payments being made to the right people? Are nursing homes getting reimbursed on a timely basis? Are people who get subsidized child care, the subsidies going to the right places? So is the practical application, you know, working? Not that it's working more efficiently, not that it's meeting the goals of a more efficient, more effective, a more cost-effective, you know, delivery system, but is a system delivering? Yeah. And in that regard, over the last several years, there seems to have been progress. I think that by any measurement, there's been some progress, but there's not been systems progress.
The money man gets asked for advice from a range of different folks. If a GOP candidate is elected governor of Rhode Island, and they give you a buzz on their first day and say, what do you think about this UHIP debacle? In all likelihood, if we're at 647, it's probably not the last number that's ever going to be quoted. What's your thought process?
Well, if they had to give me that call, they probably don't deserve to be elected governor of the state. I think the first thing that needs to be done is to go and talk to the feds. Yeah. You know, sit down with the feds and find out what they see as the end game. You know, if you have a very clear definition of what the end game is, first thing you have to do is understand the end game. The end game, you know, could be 700 million, it could stay at 650 million, it could be something else. So you have to understand the end game. You have to understand the end game in terms of cost. You have to understand the end games in terms of being accountable and credible in delivering the basic services that we've talked about. And then you have to understand the end game in terms of what the operating costs are going to be. It's kind of late in the game to worry about the efficiencies and cost savings now, though maybe there would be some. So the first thing I would do is go to the feds and understand that. I would also, and this, I don't know if this has been done or not, I would, you know, bring in an outside consultant that I trusted that understand the technology, you know, to advise me that once the system is up, what do we have? And then the third thing I would do is I'd get a realistic appraisal from my counsel on, you know, where we stand, you know, with Deloitte. And
there's some pending litigation just de facto on some level of hold. Yeah. Could we see a worst case scenario in the next 4 years in which once the election is over, additional costs start piling up and we end up in some extravagant long-term litigation with Deloitte?
I don't know the answer to that question because when I read the story about it going to 650 million, I was surprised. I think
6:47.
6:47. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It was just
My
friends.
might be up since Thursday.
Well, it's like the market; it fluctuates.
Right.
But this one never goes down. You can always. I think the new administration, even the old administration, should probably do have a restart and ask the kinds of questions that I've asked. Keep in mind, if the current administration gets elected, it's a lame duck administration. So there's really no political reason not to get this thing straightened out. And those are the basic kinds of questions. Now, perhaps they've done that. The other thing I'd want to find out is, okay, when this thing is up and running, what is its state of the art? If it's not state of the art, I really can't start again, because how can I put the people of Rhode Island, through another process of putting up a state-of-the-art system?
Listen, there's not too much technology that's now five going on 6 years old that's state-of-the-art.
Well, the abacus in China is probably one of them.
The abacus. Let's jump over in the last few minutes, talk a little bit of politics. We are 5 weeks away from the respective primaries. One candidate, the incumbent, Governor Gina Raimondo, has a massive fundraising advantage over others. When the numbers came out last week, Governor Lincoln Chafee chimed in and said, hey, listen, you just saw an important House race in which a young woman who defeated one of the members of the Democratic leadership got outspent 10-1. We've all saw when Robert Healey spent 0 and got 22% of the vote. And he says, listen, folks are engaged. Let's start on the Democratic side. Can Matt Brown win the Democratic primary against Gina Raimondo?
I don't know that. I've not seen anything to date to indicate to me that I would bet against the incumbent, but I don't understand Democrat politics. I don't understand, excuse me, the strength of the progressives versus the strength of the more traditional Democrats. So I'm not a good person to ask, because I'm not out in the street with those people and understanding what they're saying about. I think what Matt Brown has to do, if he's to stand a chance, is not just to parrot some of the things that came from Bernie Sanders or some others, because we all know that Medicaid for all would double everybody's taxes. We know that's not going to happen. So I think it behooves him to say we can fix up Medicaid.
Yeah.
We can do things to improve the quality of health care and the delivery and access to health care, but have realistic proposals. And short of that, then it gets back to just...
By the way, if you save $400 million on UHIP, you could actually do a lot of things, right?
Well, just $138 million the state is spending, yeah.
Wouldn't we just ask for a waiver and then get the other 400? Let's go over the Republican side.
Well, to finish on the Democrats, so it really depends on the internal things about progressives versus traditionalists. On the Republican side, same thing. You got to.
I'm going to go back to the Democrats. I tried to jump you over. I'm going to go back. Is really the Democratic primary a referendum on Gina Raimondo, or is it a discussion between two different visions, Gina Raimondo and Matt Brown?
I think it's more the latter, because, and I think Democrats will come home regardless of who their candidate is. I think what they view as a Trump Republican Party is something that they just couldn't stand. So I think it's a little bit of the latter. You look at legislative races, you look at the progressives coming out, and there's a line of difference being drawn. So it's the latter, and I think those things work their way through. So on the Republican side, and I agree with you, and we've seen a number of cases to demonstrate this, that money, frankly, is still the mother's milk of politics, but there are plenty of cases, where the candidates that spend less win, but they spend less to win when certain circumstances exist, and those circumstances are people feeling good about or anxious about their economic situation. Are they happy with the cultural direction of the country is going? Do they feel that the establishment, the political establishment, or the political incumbents, I should say, are ignoring them? And then when those conditions exist, money becomes less important. Still, money is very important, and it's a question of outlier versus just less money. And so you have a Democratic Party in the state where the governor has, what, $7 million?
It's going to spend in totality $7 million
Okay,
in this election.
We have a senator running for office who's going to spend $3 million.
And then some.
And we have a state party, and this is unprecedented, that now has $500 million, in the bank, and the Republican Party has $2,000.
$500,000.
$500,000 in the bank. Just think of, in a state this size, of all the GOTV, get out the vote work you can do. So it is true, being a believer, it is true that David slew Goliath with a slingshot.
Yeah.
But that was the exception, not the rule. And so if a Republican is going to have any chance, given the huge disadvantage in terms of resources, then one of those conditions have to exist. You have to say something that gets people excited. You have to get people motivated. You have to get people to feel, boy, that a Republican candidate really can make a difference for me personally in the economy. It could stop the cultural decay that some people see, and until you hit that vein, then money is important, because it's just the old kind of traditional contest. So for a Republican to be successful, they really have to make the case that they are something different, and that something different is going to make a difference. Then you can mitigate the money. Otherwise, you can't.
Let's go to the Republican primary. Who's going to win the Republican primary?
Even if I thought I knew, I wouldn't tell you.
You wouldn't. You would not. Just between the two of us.
Yeah, just between the two of us.
Yeah.
Okay.
No prediction. No live prediction.
No, I can't even predict what the turnout would be. So if you could tell me what the turnout would be, I could start making guesses.
Listen, if anybody could ever predict what a Republican gubernatorial primary is going to be, I think the low was somewhere around, against Bruce Sunland when Betty Leonard won, was, I don't know, somewhere around 15,000.
Did she have opposition?
She did. Oh. And the high was Almond and Makeley, and that was 60,000, 55, 60,000.
I could tell you stories about that, because I was nonpartisan supporting Makeley at the time. And John Holmes later became a very good friend of mine. Worked closely with John. I think he did a great job for the party in his time. But that was a classic example of a pro knowing how to get out the vote. Now, they both won. Link became the governor. I think he served he was a good governor for his terms in office. And Makeley got a great job running Bryant University.
Absolutely, and transformed Bryant University.
So there were two in this. The state won in two ways, that one.
But that was one of the biggest upsets, and that was also a case in which Ron Makeley probably, and I'm guessing, outspent Lincoln Almond at least 3-1.
I don't know that, but I think less pork got lazy.
Less pork fattened up. Yeah. Listen, as always, thank you so much. Great insights. I think this UHIP issue will continue to be not only in the short term during this political season, but on into the future, be one of the biggest crises in Rhode Island government history.
And let me just add one thing that I have a second, and that's where money is important, because I think UHIP, is a big crisis. I think it's a potential disqualification, but an opponent, unless they have the money to get the message out and explain it probably better than you and I have had this discussion, it may be a tree falling and knowing here it fall. That's why money is important.
I appreciate it. As always, the Money Man Gary Sass here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Thank our friends at Deepwater. We're going to be back in a minute with Saul Kaplan. Big news over at Business Innovation Factory. Big distinction by Forbes magazine on what they do. We'll be back in 1 minute. Welcome back, everybody, to Business Monday. We're here at the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I am here with Mr. Saul Kaplan, founder, chief catalyst of Business Innovation Factory, who is slapped all over Forbes magazine for being, what is it, one of the 5 coolest cats? What was the designation by Forbes?
Well, there was an article this week from a regular contributor in Forbes who lists the top corporate innovation events, and our summit was listed in the top 5, which is a big honor for us. Lots of national publicity, creates a lot of buzz and interest for the event. So we're honored. It basically, said if you had to pick 5 conferences to go to get the most compelling ideas for innovation and to create the best networks and connections, that these were the 5 events. And so to be listed on this was quite an honor. It happened while I was away in Kansas City last week. So it just convinces me I should travel more. Good things happen.
So how many, when you were at the airport, how many autograph seekers came up to you looking for? And just we just got notified that GoLocal's press pass has been replaced by the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and the New York Times, now covering BIF Summit. Congratulations, that's well deserved. It is one of the great events. It is that brain stretcher. And that's really how they described it. It's one of those things to really expand how you think about business and what you're doing with your organization. And I think it's
more leaders would understand that if you want to learn something new, you don't go to the same events every year with the same people in your industry, that talk about the same types of solutions. Nothing new comes out of those discussions. And so events like ours are designed to help stretch your thinking, to learn from people outside of your industry. But you have to be willing to do it. You have to put yourself in the environment to do it. So it's not everybody's cup of tea, but you would think more and more leaders would understand that they need to collide with what I call the unusual suspects, to learn from new perspectives. And if you look at their travel schedule, in their calendar, the only meetings they go to are industry meetings where it's the same people year in, year out, all looking over each other's shoulder to see what they can copy from someone else in the industry. It doesn't really drive an innovation agenda.
No, and the more mature the industry, actually, the less information is shared. In our space, in digital media, when the first events, summits, trade shows, whatever you want to call, were much more organic, and there was much more free flow of ideas, and now they're very guarded, and they're close to the vest, and they're almost press.
Which makes it even worse, because if you're not sharing what you're doing, you're not open to new thinking, and the people that you're working with are a closed community. And innovation more and more works by exposing at the edges what you're doing, because you can't predict it, and so that's kind of a catch-22. Right?
Absolutely.
The closer I keep it inside, and I work in an insular way with just the people I'm comfortable with, the less likely I am to get exposed to new ideas. If you're not uncomfortable and you're not traveling at the edge, you're highly unlikely to see the latest trends and to be able to act on them. So we take that to heart, and we organize our event and all the work we do throughout the year that way. More random collisions, more willingness to combine and recombine things that you wouldn't expect to go together to actually change the customer value equation. It sounds simple, but we don't do it.
Let's talk about random collisions or unrandom collisions. Gary and I spent the better part of half an hour talking about UHIP. We're up to $647 million to build a technology platform. I want me one of those contracts, let me tell you that. You came out of that space. That is literally how you earned your bones. At what point, I'll try and keep you out of the political fray.
Well, thank you.
But at what point do you just have to say, and just to give you the historical perspective, the first scope of work under Governor Chafee was for $119 million. The next scope of work was the major expansion to really the structure that it's now under Governor Raimondo is $246 million. We're now $400 million above that secondary scope of work. You know, at some point, do you contemplate pulling the plug?
Well, it's the gift that keeps on giving here, isn't it?
It ain't giving to taxpayers of the United States of America or Rhode Islanders, and it's not giving to the end user. I mean, that's the end user are the most needy people in the state of Rhode Island, and the lines are still there, and the failure of the system is still there, and there's not compliance with the federal requirements of delivering a system.
Yeah, well, you reference back to the work I did when I was at Accenture, one of the big systems building houses. I was the strategy guy, so the systems guys hated me, right? Because I was the guy that came in to frame, what are we here for? Before we start spending all this money, what are we trying to do? Throughout the process, right? Our teams were always the ones to make sure that we're still in alignment with the strategy.
Right.
And as it became clear that it was going to take more time or more resource, let's take the time to reassess, is this still on strategy? Your question about when do you pull the plug is always about from here forward, right? And to try to leave behind the politics, you know, and the difficult decisions about the sunk costs.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
The question is always, what does it take to finish it? What does it take to stay on strategy and to get the benefit that you're actually looking for? So if you're not constantly doing that analysis at every milestone, you find yourself in a situation where you get very far down the path. If you keep projects going because it's politically difficult to stop it,
right?
My question is always, even now, even this far into UHIP, right? We can go back in time and we can say, should we have done it differently? But that's academic,
right? Absolutely.
And in
and the
politics, we like to do that.
Right.
But for me, this is a straightforward analysis of where are we, how far are we away from getting the actual benefit. I agree with you that the benefit has to be framed from the lens of us citizens who live here, the people who need access to these capabilities and to these resources and these programs, as opposed to the business case from what's the head count in government, you know, that we're going to be able to count, or the money there. That's a secondary objective.
Right.
I don't think we were as focused on by putting all of these disparate systems into one mega project, what the actual benefit was to the people who benefit from these things. And I think we've been fighting that all along through multiple administrations. This latest round, here we go, you know, no, it's 20% of the resource that comes, give or take, from Rhode Island,
right?
You know, versus about 80% that comes from the feds,
right?
But still the same analysis. You would think that the feds would ask the same question, right? But for us, 20% of a very big number is real money,
yeah.
Right? And so it is absolutely right to ask the question, how far are we away? What confidence do we have that we can get there? Then you dial in the partners. So it's still not clear to me the extra $30 million that the Rhode Island is going to have to bear. What burden is, you know, Deloitte going to
absolutely
play in that? We still don't know the answer to
that
question. But either way, how close are we? Are we going to actually get the benefit? Are Rhode Islanders going to benefit from this? And should we, you know, suck it up and see our way through to the completion? What you have to do to answer your question about when should we pull the plug, you have to compare the go-forward path to finish it with the alternative. Right? So before you can say pull the plug, that might sound great politically. What would you do if you did? If you literally pulled the plug on this project this far into it?
Well, certainly there was an infrastructure system in place prior to the launch of UHIP.
Is it still up?
Don't know the answer.
So,
but also let's add one more wrinkle to a very complex question, which is, listen, when it was envisioned in Chafee's second to last year, we're talking about 2013 going into 2014. We're not talking about 5-year-old technology. That's where the award was given to Deloitte. 5 years in technology, infrastructure, and platform is 1 billion years in the structure of the Acropolis. So, you know, at what point are we going to just be kicking ourselves? This has all, listen, we've already had threatened litigation. I believe there's pending lawsuits that are on hold for whatever reason, either via negotiations or for political reasons to get through an election. But at some point, there's going to be some level of mediation at best or litigation at worst over a significant amount of financial resources in all likelihood.
To your point about the huge project done in a way that by the time you get there becomes obsolete given new technologies. Right. This is a question I've had all along, right? How unique is the need here in Rhode Island versus the other 50 states and large municipalities, right? And I already know in some of these cases, like for SNAP and some of those other programs, there are national providers that have a platform that works across the country, and they put a front end on it, you know, to make it custom.
Give it a state logo.
And then all the changes happen behind the scenes, and the way you pay for that access to that is different than hiring the huge consulting firms and then having to maintain and operate the system here locally. We're heading towards a world where more of those capabilities are in the cloud, right, than big, huge systems that are built locally in the company, in the municipality. So I have that same question about, you know, what was the evaluation of stick building a system locally with very large contracts versus using third-party platforms and then customizing what was really important to customize here. And now we've gone so far down this path that the only analysis you can do is what does it look like if you stop it? What does it look like if you complete it? And you have to factor in the alternatives, right, in order to do that math. And I'm not close enough to the details to understand that. And then, of course, politics does, in fact, enter into it, because who wants to stand up and say we're pulling the plug on an investment that big, even if that's the right answer? So you're right, it's complicated math. We're very deep into it. And now we should be all in on getting the benefits to our families and making sure we have the fastest, most economic path to get there, not factoring in the sunk costs that are already.
If this was the private sector, and it's not, right? It's not, and I think sometimes we confuse public sector versus private sector. But if this was the private sector, what would be the path work? Would it be bringing in a separate consulting group to analyze where we are to date and to get some independent thought process?
Well, I'm not so sure. A lot of people like to think the sectors are so different. The truth is, large enterprises that make big capital-intensive systems choices have this exact problem we're talking about, where a particular CEO and leadership team, you know, gets committed to a very large capability. We went through this with enterprise systems. Right? And guess what? All the different functions that used to have their own system, right? They resisted it, right? Because it meant they had to conform to what a common. It's the same story as with UHIP, right? So we had the same thing. Each of those programs wanted their own system, and they resisted the change. So some of this is technology, a lot of it is people, right? And being willing to work on a shared platform in service of better value, not just for your program, but for everyone. I'm sure when UHIP was imagined, it was with a case, just like any big corporation that says to every function, I don't care if you're in manufacturing or distribution or marketing and sales, we're all going to work on a shared platform, and you have to move there, and you need the power of leadership to drive you there, and you have to get there fast enough so that everybody can start working in concert. The minute you allow those different functions, different programs here with UHIP, to resist it, and the people that support those programs to lean against the change, right, and to slow walk whether they were moving to the platform. Now you have a much bigger problem than just technology. And guess what? In a lot of these projects, it's those people issues, right, that we don't put the resources behind. We expect the people issues to resolve themselves. Those are the hardest issues. It's never just the technology. It's all about everybody buying into a shared vision of what we were trying to do. So even if the case was solid when UHIP first started, along the way, we didn't have all of the leadership necessary to look at the milestone and say, where are we? Call out people issues that weren't conforming, right? be able to tailor the technology approach along the way, and we just got ourselves deeper and deeper. And now we're at a point where, boy, to try to spin the scenario where we're going to walk away from all that, that's really hard to wrap your mind around. More importantly, figure out what's left to do.
Yeah.
Get it done so we can get this journey behind us.
Is there any likelihood that a 6-year-old technology of cobbled together customized software and database management is likely to have a long shelf life in this world today?
You know, but you have to look beyond just the technology and the system solution. Let's look at those programs. We could ask the same question. These are the same families that benefit from lots of disparate programs. Maybe what we needed to reimagine was the way we support families in Rhode Island, as opposed to these programs that come from lots of different federal agencies and come together like right at the family level, but one program doesn't talk to the other program.
Yeah, no, absolutely not.
So this isn't just what technology to use, right? This is about what's the job to be done here? How are we helping families, and how are we using resources to help the families improve their well-being and to get better outcomes? And what we should have looked at is, let's change the way those actual programs work. Let's use the same amount of money to have more impact, you know, at the family level.
Well, but when we started, we only had $119 million. Now we have $647 million.
And we still haven't solved the problem.
That's right.
And we haven't changed any of the programs yet either.
So during the lunch breaks of BIF Summit, do you think you could throw out a little case history to all the attendees and do a giant whiteboard brainstorming session to try and take on this issue?
Everybody at the BIF Summit has been in debacles like this in their companies, in their communities, and they are wired to come up with new approaches and different ways to solve the problem. One thing I love about the community is we don't admire the problem and whine about it. We don't point fingers at each other and say, you know, it's your fault that we're here or your fault that it's here. We're all about, as a community, right? Here's the problem. Let's get it right in front of us. Who are we trying to help here? Families, right? What do they actually need? And then we don't accept any of the constraints. We want, like, change the federal program, change the bureaucracy, change the technology, change whatever lever you need to change in order to fix the problem. And what happens is we work on every aspect of that and we lose sight of what we were trying to do in the first place.
Did you ever go to Tom Monahan's creative training boot camp?
I never did.
So Tom Monahan,
he's quite good. I know.
He's great at it, and he's one of the legendary advertising executive creative director in America. And at his camps that he does, one of the things he does is reverse engineers a problem and says, let's design the worst of something. Right? So if it's a mattress, it's going to be wet, and there's going to be spikes sticking out of it, and it's going to smell, and all those things, and then you invert it. It kind of feels like with UHIP, we did the first part of Tom's exercise. We just haven't done that reverse engineering. Easy, fast, inexpensive, mobile, available to everybody.
Here's the most frustrating part of this conversation here in Rhode Island. We're small enough where the number of families we have to help is a known number.
Right.
You know, we could actually get to know every family, the names, the people in the family, what it is that they need in order to move forward, and we could put together programs that were more specific to individual families. Instead, what we have are 800 programs, federal, state, none of which talk to each other, and we get frustrated because then the tax burden is too high.
Absolutely.
Right? And so the solution is easier to say than to do, is to exactly what you just said. How about we actually work
By the way,
with
for
families?
$647 million, we could add a caseworker assigned to every single family. Let's jump over to, we've seen some reverberations in the social media networks, Facebook and Twitter, both seeing hemorrhaging on their stock valuations. Have we hit a milestone on these, on Facebook and Twitter, in which, maybe these companies have hit a level of maturity and now may start to see a different projection?
Well, I do think that we've certainly had some correction, and we've certainly had some tough questions about what are these platforms for,
Right.
what are the implications for society, and so these questions are not going away. And so whether or not these platforms and their owners are going to be able to continue to grow through it, and be able to figure out how to keep consumers pleased and to deal with some of these issues remains to be seen, right? You could make a case that some of these things might be at their peak,
Right.
and you're going to start seeing a new generation of platforms and tools that are closer to the customer and better suited to the needs. But there's no evidence of that yet. Even some of the curveballs that have been thrown at a Facebook,
Yeah.
right? Leave Twitter aside, it's a different case for
Yeah.
at least for Facebook. There's no evidence yet, that Mark Zuckerberg or their leadership team are thinking about a different model, right? Right now they seem to be on a path of powering through this.
Yeah, and adding more ornaments to the tree, a
And
dating.
they took a correction. They took a big
yeah.
hit in terms of their market cap, but they're so huge. I mean, Apple, now $1 trillion, and
Right.
Facebook kind of behind them. These numbers sound huge to us. To them, it's paper worth. We'll see how they power through it. I do think that there are a lot of tough questions that need to be answered about the role these technologies play in our lives, and I think you're going to see some new models emerge, right? Not just one size fits all or one winner takes all. And I think you see the capital markets changing. If you look at some of the IPO market for some of these tech players that are trying to position themselves to become public, whether
Right.
it's Uber or Airbnb, right? I think a couple of things have changed, right? There's all these questions that you're talking about the role of these platforms in addressing these issues. There's also the sources of capital. All of a sudden, private equity, and very large amounts of capital are coming in, keeping these companies private for much longer.
Right.
Because when you go public, right, now that's a whole different level of scrutiny and transparency than when you're private, right? So if you're part of the ownership interest of these companies,
You want them
right,
cleaned up pretty good.
You want them cleaned up pretty good. You also, if you can extend the runway and stay private longer and keep raising the capital, if you can get $17 billion of capital without going public and issuing any stock, why would you go public?
Right.
And so the question is, at what point do we actually convert this? And it gets back to, and we've talked about this, we've had some local instances. At what point do you need to some of the folks want to take some chips off the table, right? So going public is a nice way to do that because you can sell stock into it.
Right.
When it's privately held, how do you commercialize your ownership interests? There's some of that, but anything you can do to delay it, and now what's happening with Uber and Airbnb is you would have thought they would have gone public already,
Right.
Because the market is pretty good. But
Spectacular.
there's a lot of tough questions for tech and tech platforms, and there's a lot of interest in private equity. I read some rumor the other day that maybe Warren Buffett puts a big chunk of change into Uber that's already raised $17 billion.
Right.
So why would you go public?
Right.
If you didn't have to. So I think there's a lot of things that are changing, ranging from the way we think about these big tech platforms and the way we raise capital to advance those platforms is changing. So I think I think we have to see some shakeout, and then we have to wait and see what those changes mean if you're sitting there on the sidelines trying to start something or raise capital.
But there is also a reality of market changes, and back in the day I was involved with a company, missed their opportunity, hit the tech bubble, and they were dead, gone, buried.
Gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were a Class A IPO. They'd raised it $50 or $60 million through a C round. They were ready to go, and they decided to hold off a few months, and big mistake.
No, but it's a timing game. If you can predict the future, you're better than me, right? If you can predict the future and know what's the exact right time to go, right? I don't think it's that the multiples have suffered. Yeah, there's been a little bit of a correction, but they could go, and they could get a very healthy multiple for what they're doing. The question is at the right time to take it public, to be transparent, because you know what you have to do, not only to support the IPO, but also on an ongoing basis when you're a publicly traded company, what you have to share and communicate is much different than when you're a private company.
So you saw Facebook and Twitter, both public companies, take significant stock hits, losing about 10 to 20% of their value in a week's period of time. On the flip side, you saw Amazon racing through the roof and raising more and more questions about whether or not there's a role for regulatory action. I think sort of, that company just continues to spread its wings and continues to dominate the retail world, expanding in services and different offerings that they make to the consumer. Where you get any sense of, in your crystal ball, what the challenges are going to be? Is de facto Amazon's really biggest challenge the regulatory world of the of concerns about monopolistic structure and its impact on the marketplace?
They certainly have to pay more attention to that than they ever had before. I've said to you before, I think a lot of this HQ2 thing and opening this up to 20 now cities around the country, right, is, yes, in part tapping into talent rather than relying on one geography for all that headquarters talent, but it's also a part of their strategy to increase their surface area in the public, to get more government institutions, kind of embedded in the story. And so I've always thought that, which is why I don't have any inside information, but it wouldn't shock me if they were down in the Washington corridor, building a huge economic presence there. It's also fun to watch the economic incentive play, because here they come, $5 billion of promised capital, 50,000 jobs going to another location, and all of these 20 places. Now, they've visited all 20 of them. You still can't get any real detailed information about what these offers are and how much taxpayers are going to depend on to pay this. So you start to see some of that pushback. I mean, I'm surprised. I mean, I would have thought it's in Amazon's best interest to get as much as they can, but given what they need to do in terms of changing the conversation from a regulatory standpoint, they should have forced everyone to be transparent. You want to be one of the finalists for this, you share transparently what it is you're proposing for us, because it's not in Amazon's best interest to go pick a community where the first time the taxpayers hear what their politicians
there's a
promised,
revolution.
You can imagine how big those incentive checks are going to be, right? I would have forced it to be transparent much sooner and take the risk. Like Boston's been more transparent than many of them, and some people say that's hurting their chances, right? But as far as I'm concerned, if you're not transparent with the taxpayers in your community about what will likely be the biggest set of incentive checks ever written by whoever wins this, I mean, I can't wait to see who the politicians are.
Well, and part of the reality of Boston is, there really is the question, could you even add 50,000 new jobs to the Boston metro area, just from a physical infrastructure standpoint, locating them, et cetera, et cetera. Last thing before you go, BIF Summit, we are now 5 weeks away. No pressure. We've talked about Forbes' recognition of being one of the top 5 such meetings in the United States. Let's talk a little bit about who else can we expect, and how close are we to sellout?
Yeah, so we're right on track. I mean, we track it pretty closely. We sell it out every single year. We try to leave enough room for scholarships, and for people that we really want in the room that don't have the resources for it. We're very generous that way. So there's always an opportunity for someone who's really motivated to come. But we sell it out every year. We're limited by the 500 people, right?
The prices on Ace tickets are already peaking at about $1,700.
Yeah. Well, we're grateful for that because it helps offset the costs of what we do. But it will sell out. We're ahead of track from where we were last year. It's always frustrating because people wait until the end. Wish they would make the commitment sooner, but oh well, that's just human nature. Today I spoke with Rita King, who's one of the storytellers. Rita is the executive director of a Science House down in New York. She's one of the world leading experts in how to harness imagination, and makes the case that imagination is not just for the creative types, and the rest of us wait for them imaginative people to come home. She tries to coax the imagination out in every single one of us, and tries to help us figure out how to integrate what's next into what's now, to change what's happening on the ground in your company, for yourself personally, in your community. And she's as smart and articulate as it gets in talking about how to unleash your imagination to make your communities, companies, and yourselves better. She is awesome. And I'm so glad she's joining us here in Providence on the 13th and 14th of September.
Excellent. Last thing, Bird Scooters. We had Peter Nerona on here on Friday, and I think as Attorney General and the person who might have to defend the state of Rhode Island if he's elected, that this needs a little regulatory framework for people's public safety. We cringe looking out the window almost every day. Somebody goes zipping down. Sometimes we know the people. Most of the time, almost always, they don't have a helmet on. These are Providence roads. I don't know if they got the memo, but not always the most pristine, smoothest. This is not exactly the Indianapolis 500 course. Is this an example of innovation right on the edge of?
I don't know if I would call scooters, and it's not exactly rocket science to create a motorized scooter. The business model around it is kind of interesting, and here's my view on the regulation. You can never regulate out ahead of
innovation.
All of these things, and so as new technologies and capabilities kind of emerge, I think we should have we should be receptive to them and want and to welcome them, and then we should have a new way of thinking about regulation to balance the interests of
but do we have to wait till the horrible accident and the poor kid who gets brain damage?
I don't know how you regulate for everything in advance, and I also, the kind of regulation that makes me kind of shiver is regulation in the form of somebody advocating because those scooters compete with us. Right? Like, I'm sorry. We want to be about innovation here. We're going to allow innovation to come in, and if you have to compete harder or work harder, to serve customer needs, I'm sorry for that, but you're going to be better off. The kind of regulation we need is what's the citizen's interest, right? What's the citizen's interest to make sure that we are appropriately protecting the safety of our citizens? That I get, and we need that, right? And so we need a legislature that understands new technology, has the capacity to have a good debate about it, and knows how to keep the private commercial interests out who are just trying to block it because they don't want other alternative services offered here in Rhode Island.
But the only barrier from operating one, even outside the suggested regulatory structure, is to have a smartphone. Right, that's the only barrier. You just need a smartphone to be able to.
But there's more and more technologies that are going to look like that, that with low barriers, easy to put out there. And so like what I would say to Peter is, great. If you get elected, you're going to come into that role during a time where how we think about regulation and protecting the citizen has to evolve and innovate the same way the technologies are. Right, and you got to keep up with it. The job isn't going to change, and you can't allow overreach on the regulatory side.
You have 2 lunches at BIF Summit? Two lunches. So day 1, you're going to fix UHIP. Day 2, you're going to come up with the regulatory structure for the Bird Scooter. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Thank Saul Kaplan for joining us as always, and thanks our friends over at the Navigant Credit Union and of course at Deepwater Wind for all their support. Tomorrow we'll be back, and I think we've got 2 hours with our friends here with Rachel Nunes and with Kate Nagel. Thanks everybody, stay cool. We'll see you tomorrow on Go Local Live.